Welcome, everyone. My name is Thane Rosenbaum. I'm the creative director of the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society at Truro University. And welcome to the FOLCS Headlines Series. Tonight, Russia's invasion of Ukraine with our special guest, the always brilliant, charming, and entertaining Niall Ferguson, old friend of ours. Niall is a very, very astute observer of world events. He's a global historian with large range of knowledge, has written widely on the rise of and fall of both empires and nations and economies, public intellectual of the first order, the author of many, many books, hundreds of essays. He's had faculty appointments at Harvard and at Stanford and at NYU. He's been a senior fellow at both the Kennedy School and now presently at the Hoover Institute. Welcome, our friend Niall Ferguson. Welcome to FOLCS, Niall. Thank you.
It's great to be with you, Thane, and with FOLCS, which a pun that I figured out just about a minute ago.
Where it comes from, right? Exactly. If you are watching us live on YouTube, welcome. We love that you're watching us live, but make sure you come to folks.org and give us your email address. That way we can give you updates to our future events, and you can register that way as well. If you've got a question for Niall, people apparently have already left them both in the chat box and the Q&A box. Please try to leave them in the Q&A box, but we will definitely check the chat box as well. So we're expecting, Niall, you never disappoint. And so tonight, the folks audience is brainy. So we're going to really get into the weeds here of some things that never really get covered, I think, and discussed. So let's just start with something simple, which is today, Zelensky spoke to the UN Security Council. And, we've heard him speak everywhere. He did speak today about the atrocities that have become known in Ukraine. He spoke at the Grammys. He spoke at the Congress. It did seem today, however, that he's become more exasperated by the West's reluctance to help more. And up until now, he's been very diplomatic and respectful, but you could always sense that he's wondering, why not more? And today he seemed to be indicting the UN. Is that your sense of what was happening today? And do you think he's going to get anywhere in trying? And the reason I'm asking this is because, and this is the key Niall Ferguson question. One of my favorite of your books is Colossus, which, among other things, takes a real hard look at the United States and says, the United States wants to promote representative democracy, free markets, the rule of law, but it doesn't want to promote it enough that it puts its money and more treasure on the line. And I'm wondering whether this is, for Niall Ferguson, an example of what the argument you made in Colossus, that we talk what we want. We have a president who says all the right things, but we're not making the president of Ukraine happy.
Well, I watched the UN Security Council meeting that occurred, if you remember, on the eve of the invasion of February 24th, with my 10-year-old son, Thomas, and he was incredulous, and I had to explain to him what was happening. I explained that the Ukrainian ambassador to the United Nations was complaining about the fact that the chair of the UN Security Council was occupied by the Russian ambassador and permanent representative, and that he was representing the country that was about to invade Ukraine. And under those circumstances, not surprisingly, the proceedings of the UN Security Council were farcical. I think, is a very intelligent boy. He could see the absurdity of the situation, that as a permanent member of the UN Security Council from its very inception, Russia, as the heir of the Soviet Union, can prevent the United Nations taking any action. It has a veto that it disapproves of. And of course, any resolution censoring Russia is therefore going to be vetoed, even when it has the support of an overwhelming majority of UN members. So it doesn't really surprise me that President Zelensky had a somewhat exasperated tone. It is, in fact, a perfect illustration of the limits of the institutions that were created at the end of World War II, that this war is happening at all. It illustrates the limits of the whole notion of collective security if at the heart of the system there is a Security Council on which Russia wields a veto, and so too does the United States, and so too does China, and so too does the UK, and so too does France. The permanent members of the UN Security Council have this diplomatic superpower. If one of them decides to carry out an act of wanton aggression, then the UN is essentially paralyzed.
Right. And of course, the Human Rights Council of the United Nations is a veritable rogues gallery of human rights violators. So I don't know if this will make Thomas's head explode even more if we showed him that list. I wonder, though, it's interesting that Zelensky said today, I think he used the words, we need a Nuremberg-style tribunal to deal with these Russian atrocities. And my first thought was, he surely knows that what made a Nuremberg-style tribunal possible was crushing Germany. Yeah. That these things don't really work until you bring these countries to their knees, and then all of a sudden you can get enforceable arrest warrants. Remember, even with the ICC, the International Criminal Court, shockingly, it took 6 years to get an enforceable arrest warrant on Bashir from the genocides in Sudan. And as far as I know, he's still, even with the arrest warrant, was never prosecuted with the ICC. So I wonder, that's another subject for Thomas to contemplate, but I'm not sure any of these entities work in playing the role of judicial review, of proper punishment, of supervisory, and as you point out, just the whole concept of European protection obviously didn't work here because Putin is operating carte blanche. Go ahead, yeah.
Well, I was going to say that the war crimes issue is an extraordinarily important one in light of the atrocities that were revealed in Bucha, and which almost certainly have taken place in other Ukrainian towns. I dread to think what will be found when Mariupol is, as I hope it one day will be, liberated from Russian occupation. The problem about approaching this question now is this, that the war is not over. It is not, I believe, close to being over. And if you say at this stage that Russia has committed war crimes, that the Russian president is himself a war criminal, and go further and say that he should be removed from power, which President Biden did when he gave his speech in Warsaw just over a week ago, you do create a very high stakes situation. As you said, the Nazi leaders were not put on trial until the total destruction of the Third Reich and the death of Hitler. Their unconditional surrender was the necessary prerequisite for those trials. I don't think that even in his wildest imaginings, President Zelensky expects to win such a comprehensive victory over Russia that those things are likely to be replicated in this case. In truth, what Ukraine has done so far is to avoid losing, which is different from winning a war. It has performed spectacularly well. His leadership has been inspirational. I know Mr. Zelensky. I've spent time with him. I go to Ukraine more or less every year. I've been there multiple times in the last decade, and I've sat next to him and exchanged ideas with him. I've been impressed by him, by his charm and his wit and his obvious intelligence, but I never quite foresaw that this man could become a Churchillian leader of his nation. It's deeply impressive. It's also impressive that the Ukrainian people have fought so tenaciously against the invader. All of this is magnificent, but they do face, if one takes a step back, daunting odds. Not only is the Russian Federation territorially vast, demographically larger, and armed to a far greater extent, not least in nuclear capability, but there is also a profound difference It is Russia that occupies Ukrainian territory right now. And so we're a very long way away from being able to say that Ukraine has won this war, although Elliot Cohen saw fit to write that in the Washington Post last week.
Right.
I know enough about war to know that this isn't victory. So I think it's premature to start publicly talking of war crimes trials and the removal of President Putin from power. For the next few weeks, a battle is going to unfold for the control of the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. That is where the action has now shifted, because the Russian attempt to take Kyiv has clearly failed, and Odessa is, I don't think, about to be occupied by an amphibious landing force. So the action shifts to the Donbass, and there is a non-trivial probability that the Russians can use their superior firepower to carve out control of the Donbass. They could even successfully encircle Ukrainian forces there. And that will be something that President Putin can present as victory back in Russia if his army can achieve it. And so in that sense, it's a little premature to start planning the war crimes trial and looking forward to Putin's appearance at The Hague. All of this seems to me a very distant prospect. And I'll add one more thing, if I may, Thane. I take a different view, I think, strategically of the situation from the Biden administration. If I were in their position, I would be trying very hard indeed to end the fighting as soon as possible, not just out of humanitarian motives, though clearly with every passing day, more and more people die, but also because I think there's a big strategic risk unfolding here. If you let this war carry on, and Russia is unable to win even a limited victory in the east of Ukraine, there is a real risk of Putin's ordering the use of weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, potentially nuclear weapons. And for that reason, I think it's urgent that we achieve a ceasefire and try, by whatever means we can, to stop the war. The longer it lasts, I think the higher the risk of something really catastrophic occurring. And I worry a little bit that by talking about war crimes and talking about regime change in Russia, we raise the probability unwittingly of an absolutely disastrous development.
So you've been on all the cable stations over the last month, and I read somewhere just very recently where you said where the United States doesn't seem to act as if it has an interest in seeing a ceasefire, which is exactly opposite of what you're suggesting that President Biden should be seriously thinking about it. Do you want to avoid nuclear weapons? Do you want to avoid, other types of gas? The best way to do this is come to a ceasefire. But I like the fact that you invoke Churchill, and as a Scotsman and educated at Oxford, of course you would remember Churchill waiting on the United States with the Lend-Lease program, and the United States dragged its feet. People remember the United States did not enter World War II to either save Jews or save the British, neither one. If not for the bombing of Pearl Harbor, I'm not sure we would have ever gotten it. So I wonder whether when you use the word Zelensky Churchillian, whether it has, particularly given who you are as a historian and as a man of Britain, that you know what you're talking about. And as someone who's written a book about the United States not following through in what it needs to do to assert itself as a superpower, I wonder if this is when you say, I think this is what Biden should do, why isn't he doing that? Because you seem to observe that the United States doesn't seem to think a ceasefire is in anyone's interest.
Well, let me try and explain what I think is going on. I think what is going on is that the Biden administration has taken over from its predecessor, from Donald Trump's administration, a view that the principal strategic threat the United States faces comes from China. And their view of the war in Ukraine has to be seen in that context. The reason that the United States is supplying arms on a pretty significant scale to Ukraine is clearly to make sure that Putin doesn't achieve his initial objective, which was to decapitate the Ukrainian government and install a puppet of the sort that existed prior to the 2014 Maidan revolution. And I think it's absolutely right that we have armed the Ukrainians. I wish we had armed them more last year and the year before, because the arms shipments to Ukraine tailed off after 2018 in ways that left them very vulnerable. I wish we'd done a lot of things differently last year. I wish we hadn't taken the sanctions off the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I wish that we hadn't explicitly said that we would not take military action if Russia invaded Ukraine. But leave all that to one side. Now that the war is happening, now that sanctions failed to deter Putin, what exactly are we trying to achieve? And my understanding, based on things that people in the administration have said, including the speech that Joe Biden gave in Warsaw, is that we want the war to keep going. In the Warsaw speech, which I read carefully, Joe Biden talked about a protracted struggle comparable with the First Cold War, culminating in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then 2 years later with the fall of the Soviet Union. If that's the analogy, I think there is a lot of risk. If, and I think this is also true, the analogy is with Afghanistan in 1979, if our idea is that we arm the Mujahideen, only this time the Mujahideen are Ukrainians, what does that mean? What it means is, of course, the utter destruction of Ukraine. Because think of what 10 years of war in Afghanistan did after 1979. If we think that by making Russia bleed, and I've heard that term used, in Ukraine, we're sending a signal to China, keep your hands off Taiwan, I'm not sure that that is at all how the Chinese are interpreting what's happening. So what I see is a strategy that is in some ways cynical. Let the Ukrainians do the fighting, let them bleed Russia dry. But at the same time, it's a strategy that is in some ways over-optimistic, let me put it that way, in that they seem to think that sanctions plus attrition in Ukraine will bring about Putin's downfall, and that this will deter Xi Jinping from trying to grab Taiwan. And I don't think either of those things is at all likely. I don't think Putin's going to be overthrown. I think that's a really low probability scenario. And I don't think the Chinese are going to be deterred from, at some point, making a move against Taiwan. So for all these reasons, I think the strategy that the Biden administration is pursuing is misconceived and very risky, because if you end up boxing Putin in, he's a war criminal, he's got to be overthrown. If he doesn't win his conventional war for control of the Donbass, what is he likely to do? Is he going to go on state television and say, I'm terribly sorry, I made an awful blunder and I hereby resign the presidency of the Russian Federation? Or does he drop a nuclear weapon on Lviv to end the war by those ruthless means? I know which I think is the more likely of those two alternatives.
So here's how you've now said this 3 different times, so it's very frightening to hear. You've invoked the nuclear option several times. One of the things I wanted to ask you, and you've just opened up this question, which is, does Putin not know the established rules of the Cold War? Does he either not know? He's a former KGB agent, and we assume he does, right? He's a man of a certain age, but does he not understand that the rules of the Cold War was to keep the war cold and to essentially threaten one another with assured mutual destruction? But that we're not going to actually use them. Is Putin more like the Ayatollahs of Iran that actually use words like wiping countries off the map and might do that? I mean, that's what I always worried about Iran. I never lose sleep thinking that the French have a nuclear weapon or that the British have. It never even occurs to me. But I think there are some countries that, what's the professional word for this? Crazy. I think crazy is the professional word. You're just crazy, and crazy enough to use it. So I'm wondering, listening to you tonight already, do you think that Putin is more Ayatollah than Brezhnev, Khrushchev, Gorbachev?
Well, I'm not sure that it's right to think of Putin as an Ayatollah or as crazy. I think it's more that he understands the Cold War better than we do. And that's because having been a KGB operative in the later stages of the Cold War, he identified some of the peculiarities of the Cold War that we've now forgotten. For example, by the later phase of the Cold War, it was well understood that NATO could not withstand a conventional forces war against the Red Army. If the Red Army moved against Western Europe, we would not have the conventional forces to defeat it. And therefore, NATO doctrine was in fact a doctrine of limited nuclear war. We would use tactical nuclear weapons to stop the Red Army's advance in that contingency. It never happened, but that was actually the plan. Now the roles are reversed. If there were a conventional war between NATO and Russia, really Russia wouldn't be able to win. It's barely been able to defeat Ukraine. It would certainly not stand much chance if it found itself against US-led NATO forces. But to compensate for that disadvantage, in just the way that we did in the 1980s, Russia has battlefield tactical nuclear weapons. The idea that those will never be used is, I think, in some ways, a suspension of disbelief. The belief that we didn't have World War III because of mutually assured destruction is arguably a complete fantasy. Because in truth, we didn't have nuclear war because we were lucky. We were lucky during the Cuban Missile Crisis because the Soviets did not take the action that they might have taken to use a nuclear weapon. And we were lucky in '83 too, when a similar situation arose. I am one of those historians of the Cold War who regards it as more luck than anything systemic, anything embedded in the theory of deterrorism, that we didn't have, the theory of deterrence, that we didn't have World War III. Fast forward to Cold War II, and you can see why Putin is thinking the way that he is. In Cold War II, Russia's the junior partner, China's the senior partner. But Russia has way more nukes than the Chinese, even though the Chinese are building nuclear weapons faster than almost anything else that they're building in China right now. The one thing that distinguishes Putin from Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi or any of the other tyrants toppled in recent years is precisely that nuclear arsenal. And here's the critical point thing. When Putin mentioned nuclear weapons early on in the crisis, when he raised the alert level and implied pretty clearly a threat to use those weapons, how did we respond? Well, that was when we revealed that we'd forgotten the lessons of the Cold War because we actually backed away from providing Polish fighter jets to the Ukraine.
Right.
We responded to a nuclear threat by backing off. And the Biden administration has consistently signaled that it really will do whatever it takes to avoid an escalation of this conflict that involves more than Ukraine. We're ready to arm the Ukrainians with javelins, with stingers, with now with drones. But we really keep signaling that that's as far as we want to go. And I think Putin has asked himself, I'm sure by now, the question, what would they do if I did drop a nuclear weapon on Western Ukraine? Let's suppose Lviv. Let's suppose he used the weapon to disrupt the flow of armaments eastwards to Ukrainian forces. What would we do? And I don't think we know.
So you're saying that we're the ones that forgot the lessons of the Cold War. He's the one that's maintaining those lessons.
Yes.
Let's do something that never happens on mainstream media, certainly anymore. And since we have Niall Ferguson, let's take this moment, take this opportunity. Putin's making two arguments, right? Let's just take there are at least two, but I think most people should at least know what he's saying and how a historian would respond to this. The first thing he's saying is Ukraine is a fictitious country. It's really part of Russia. It's had its flirtations with sovereignty, but it's really a fake country. It's really part of who we always were historically. And so, you know, it can talk about being independent, but it shouldn't be. And Russians live here, not Ukrainians. The second point that he seems to be making that I think is more convincing to his own people, which we'll get to in a moment, which is to say, the United States, and this is true, never says this. The only person I know who always says this is the film director Oliver Stone. He's the only one who says, no one ever says the Russians lost 30 million people in World War II with the Nazis. It has had a history of European invasions from Napoleon on, and that they are really super sensitive about a pathway from Europe into Moscow. They're super sensitive, and all you have to do, which is what he's doing, is use the word Nazi even if it's a Jewish president, it's code word for saying Napoleon is going to show up tomorrow and we have to have an Iron Curtain again. We need another Warsaw Pact. We need another bloc. Those two arguments, is there anything to those arguments? No one else wants to talk about it. I'm not trying to make Putin's argument. I'm just asking, can you understand that when the polling today, I think, came out that 83% of the Russians agree with this campaign, which seems astounding, that some of this argument is persuasive to them?
Well, these are great questions, and I think it's really important that we should understand what arguments Vladimir Putin is making, not least the arguments he's making to the Russian people. But first, remember, if you were being asked by an opinion pollster in Russia to give your opinion, knowing what you know about the Russian state, you'd probably not speak your mind if you were a critic of President Putin. So I think we have to treat opinion polls from Russia with a good deal of skepticism. But I think it's right to ask the questions you've asked. Let's start with the claim that the Russian and Ukrainian peoples are in fact one people, along with the Belarusians, and the idea of Ukrainian independence is a sort of a fraud. It's an
accident of the fall of the Berlin Wall,
or an artifact of nefarious forces. Well, this is a bad argument, but Putin set it out in considerable detail in an article that he published last July on the historic unity of the Russian and Ukrainian peoples. And when I read that article on my way to Kyiv in September, I realized that we had trouble in store, because it sounded to me like an argument for annexation, if not for the complete disappearance of Ukraine.
You thought he was showing his cards through an article?
Oh, yes. I read that article and I thought that my first thought was there's going to be a war. And wow. I tried to convey that to my friends in Kyiv. I was extremely disturbed by that article. But it's bogus history. It is fake history, because if you go back to the 17th century and look at the maps of that time, Ukraine clearly exists as a geographical entity. It is not part of the Russian Empire then. It only became part of the Russian Empire after 1709, the Battle of Poltava, when Peter the Great won his great victory. It was integrated into the Russian Empire in the course of the 18th century, but it retained a distinct identity. That's obvious to anybody who reads Russian literature. And of course, when the Russian Revolution occurred in 1917, Ukraine had a period of independence that lasted until about 1921, when the Bolsheviks imposed their authority there. It was a distinct republic within the Soviet Union, something that Putin now complains about. And when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, it became an independent state again. In the midst of the 20th century, Ukraine was so abysmally treated by Stalin that it's not entirely surprising the Ukrainians welcomed the Germans as liberators initially, after the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. And it's not surprising that at the end of World War II, for about 5 years, Ukrainian partisans were fighting against the Soviet forces to try to prevent their being reabsorbed back into the Soviet Union. So the idea that Ukraine doesn't have a distinct identity, that they're all really just Russians, is completely false. I think that's really important to get across. The second argument, which has some support from certain Western academics, that somehow all of this is the fault of the West because NATO expansion posed a threat to Russia's security. That too, I think, is false, though I want to add a caveat. NATO expansion has been in many ways vindicated by the events of the last 5.5 weeks, because if you're in Poland or in the Baltic states, or just about in any country that was either in the Soviet Union or in the Warsaw Pact and is now in NATO, you are sighing with relief that you made it into NATO, because that's the thing that protects you from Russian aggression. Ukraine's problem, which was also Georgia's problem, was that it was offered NATO membership in 2008, but never given it. And that was what made Ukraine so vulnerable. And that was, I think, the great flaw in our policy. And this is important. We should not have promised NATO membership if we did not mean to give it. And I don't think we ever did. And I think that as a result, Ukraine ended up with the worst of both worlds. It looked like it was gravitating towards NATO, but it wasn't really. Certainly not in any meaningful way, and not in a time frame that promised any great security. So I think Putin's arguments are fake arguments, but I think we have a lot of responsibility for this war because there were other options. For example, just to give an example of other paths we might have taken, in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and made Donetsk and Luhansk effectively Russian puppet states, Henry Kissinger published an article saying, this NATO option isn't going to work. It's only going to lead to conflict. We need to come up with something different. We need to make Ukraine neutral in the way that Finland was in the Cold War. And I think today that looks like a very prescient argument that we should have paid much more attention to back in 2014.
But do you think that Putin, I wouldn't say miscalculated, maybe he took a look at the world and said, no one seemed to care about Crimea, Chechnya, Georgia. By the way, no one seemed to care that I meddled in the 2016 election in the United States. Oh, by the way, I participated in 500,000 Syrians being killed. No one ever seems to be upset with us or me, Putin, Vladimir Putin. Why on earth would anyone care about Ukraine? What is it, a slow news day? I mean, and I think that's an interesting question. I suspect people looking at this saying, wait a minute, you know, this guy's actually just, you know, politically astute. He's saying no one ever cared about any of those other interventions. What made Ukraine different? Oh, and one last thing, the point that you made, no one loved Ukraine enough to invite them into NATO. So it's not Poland. So they're just like a stepson that no one really cares about. Why would they be upset? Is it because of Zelensky that we care? Is it because the pandemic seems to have worn off? Is it because the Ukrainians aren't giving up? They're fighting and they're heroic in that way. Did Putin misread this, or did he read it correctly?
Oh, he miscalculated in a couple of ways. And that goes back to the point I want to make, that he's not crazy. Sane, ruthless strategists can make miscalculations. The two miscalculations were, he thought the Ukrainians wouldn't fight. He remembered that in 2014, when he had successfully annexed Crimea and taken a chunk of the Donbass and Donetsk and Luhansk, that the Ukrainians really hadn't put up much of a fight. And I think perhaps cut off from realistic information flows, as you often become if you're a dictator, he didn't realize the extent to which the Ukrainians had really upped their military capabilities with considerable support from Western military trainers. I mean, we have played an important part, as has the United Kingdom, in improving Ukraine's fighting capability. Putin didn't see that. Secondly, he really underestimated the extent to which the West, that is NATO in practice, would hold together. He thought that the Germans were sufficiently dependent on Russian gas and oil that he didn't really have to worry too much about the sanctions, which would be US sanctions rather than large-scale Western sanctions. He was wrong about that too. Not that the sanctions have actually been sufficient to break the Russian economy, because there's a fatal hole in the sanctions. The Europeans continue to buy Russian oil and gas, and as long as they do that, the Russian state continues to function. Still, he underestimated the extent of the world reaction. And
you mean including like Luxembourg, Switzerland, right? I mean, all of a sudden, the Swiss are involved in this, right? He couldn't have imagined that.
The Finns and the Swedes are talking about joining NATO. I didn't think that would happen. So I think Putin's miscalculations were not the miscalculations of a madman. Most Western analysts, including the US intelligence services, thought the Ukrainians would not last long. And I was really surprised by the tenacity of the resistance and the amount of damage that they have inflicted on the Russian invaders. It's extraordinary. The Russian army has suffered heavier casualties in the space of 6 weeks than the Red Army experienced in 10 years in Afghanistan. It is that bad. So So Putin really didn't understand.
And so I want just to be clear, and we armed the Mujahideen even more than we have armed the Ukrainians, right?
That's
so
right.
You're saying it's even more extraordinary that they were able to hit back with less.
That's right. The amounts, if you just look at the dollar amounts of military aid to the Mujahideen, were enormous over 10 years. We dialed back our military supplies to Ukraine quite significantly after 2018, which was the peak year. And that means that the Ukrainians, although well armed, were not well enough armed to deter Russia. Now, Putin launched a 20th century operation, a poorly planned one. I don't think his military, his generals were particularly in the loop when all of this was devised. A plan that involved a relatively small invasion force, 200 to 250,000 men approaching along 5 different axes. They needed the Ukrainians to roll over. And the Ukrainians, of course, did not, and were able to inflict these casualties because the Russians had armor strung along long roads, highly exposed to drone attacks. Now, the critical thing to notice here is that these miscalculations have put Putin in an extremely vulnerable position. It's not clear that the army that he sent into Ukraine is still capable of the kind of encirclement that he wants to achieve in the Donbass. And my worry is that if they fail, if the Ukrainians continue to inflict the kind of losses they've inflicted in the last 5 weeks, his options get very drastically reduced. And I worry a lot about the possibility of escalation that he will then consider.
So you're Niall Ferguson, given your background, your history, the books you've written, The Rise and Fall of Empires, again, that book that I think is very compelling, Colossus on the United States. Given what you care about and what you've studied and written about, what does the world liberal order look like today? What would you say to us if we're saying this is something you've dedicated your life promoting, understanding, advancing? What does it look like watching it from where you're watching it now?
Well, I wrote Colossus nearly 20 years ago, began writing it on the eve of the invasion of Iraq. And the book was a pessimistic book. I actually originally wanted to call it Blind Colossus. And the publishers felt that was too negative in the atmosphere of 2003. And so the book was was initially The Price of America's Empire, but the subtitle I wanted to give it was The Rise and Fall of America's Empire. The book was pessimistic about the neoconservative project in Afghanistan and Iraq, because I argued the United States as an empire suffers from 3 structural deficits. The first is a manpower deficit. Americans really don't want to spend long periods of their lives in Mesopotamia or in Afghanistan. That's why tours of duty are short and relatively few Americans, in fact, settle in these places. The second deficit was a financial one. I mean, it's really quite hard to run an empire if you have a current account deficit, which was growing rapidly back in the early 2000s. But the third and most important deficit was the attention deficit. My argument was that the American public, after the initial shock of 9/11, would gradually lose interest in these messy wars in faraway places. And so the book argued that the American enterprise in the imperial direction, the project that the neoconservatives had, that they were going to use 9/11 to create a fundamental reordering of the greater Middle East, would fail. If anything, it took longer to fail than I expected. I didn't expect that the United States would be in Afghanistan for 20 years. But eventually, what I foresaw played out. George W. Bush's successors, all in their different ways, have been anti-imperial presidents who wanted to withdraw the United States from overseas conflicts. Obama said, we're not the global policeman. Trump said, I'm sick of all these foreign wars. And Joe Biden, as he made clear with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, is really in the same vein. These are variations on the theme of retreat from overseas empire. So where are we now? Well, I think we are paying the price of retreat because, as I've argued in many books, the problem with empires is that when they retreat, when they decline, that's actually the time of most of most violence and instability. The United States is no longer the dominant player in the Middle East. But that doesn't mean the Middle East is heading for a period of peace and tranquility. On the contrary, I think it's quite likely that we'll see a major war between Iran and, on the other side, the increasingly aligned Arab states and Israel. So the problem with the American retreat from global preeminence, whether you call it empire, hegemony, or preeminence, is that we end up with a more violent world. And that was always the great preoccupation that I had when I first started writing on these themes 2 decades ago.
But do you find that the United States is either obtuse or indifferent to the very things you're talking about, right? The red line in Syria that got erased, almost hardly showing up in Libya at all, letting the French lead. Even what you've complained about here about Ukraine, that the United States doesn't seem to see the calculus of letting this go on and what that could be, and could instead assert a diplomatic ceasefire solution. They don't seem to want to do it. I'm wondering what is the source of this? Is it because Americans no longer want to be the policeman around the world? Is because the word superpower doesn't mean anything? We'd rather be a supermodel than a superpower, right? That it's just not as interesting to us as it was during the Cold War. What is it that no one seems to listen to? If they were listening to you now, they go, Ferguson's got a point, but really, does it matter? Do we really care?
I think the fourth deficit, the deficit that I missed when I was writing Colossus, is the history deficit. We have a tremendous amnesia problem, and our policymakers often make policy without sufficient historical context. I think that's the reality. I'll illustrate this point with an example. When I was writing about the life of Henry Kissinger in the first volume of the biography I'm working on.
I'm about to talk about that soon, yes.
I quoted from long letters and reports that he wrote from Vietnam in the 1960s, before he was in government, in which he analyzed why the American intervention in Vietnam was failing. And I'll not say who it was, but somebody who'd been in the Bush administration read the book and wrote to me saying, I couldn't believe, as I was reading those passages from Kissinger's Vietnam reports, how like our predicament in Iraq it was. And I thought to myself, it's strange that that's only just occurred to you, because obviously that is precisely the kind of thing that we should keep reminding ourselves of, that the United States has intervened in distant countries before with grand ambitions, and it hasn't turned out brilliantly. It turned out really well in South Korea, and in South Vietnam it was a fail. Right. So there's a sense in which I don't think we are very good. I speak now as an American. I became an American in 2018. I don't think we're very good at learning lessons from history in a systematic way, which is why we keep making these same mistakes, expecting different outcomes. So I think part of what's missing in our policymaking process is more of a historical input. I call our current policy, with respect to Ukraine and more broadly, the Yale Law School style of foreign policy. And isn't it typical that we're planning the court case for war crimes before the war is won? That tells you that the Yale Law School mentality, which is, of course, the institution Jake Sullivan attended, is dominant, rather than the kind of thinking which I think Kissinger personifies, that emphasizes history rather than international law.
And a kind of, we'll say, Yale Law School naivete, right? Like, for instance, the Iran deal, these very same guys, right, that are negotiating, the Sullivans, these guys, actually, they can't get out of the way of themselves. I can't understand the decision to try and resuscitate the Iran nuclear deal. It's really surprising, because actually the previous administration had achieved a lot in the Middle East. They didn't get much thanks for it, but in truth, in regional terms, the Abraham Accords were a huge breakthrough. Stunning. And they had created an entirely new geopolitical situation in which Israel and the Arab states, and particularly the Gulf states, were aligning themselves against Iran. And for whatever reason, the Biden administration decided to trash that and go back to the Iran nuclear deal that nobody
other than the Iranians, wanted to see revived. I think it's odd because on China policy, the Biden administration essentially copied and pasted the Trump administration's policy. But in the Middle East, they decided to go back to the Obama era, despite the obvious failure of Obama's policies in the Middle East. So yeah, I'll call it the Yale Law School approach to foreign policy. Yale Law School is an institution that increasingly epitomizes all that's wrong with American academia. Well, perhaps that's why we see foreign policy being conducted in this, in my view, increasingly ineffectual and very risky way.
And also like a faculty lounge sort of way, right? The perceptions of a faculty lounge. I just want to quickly do some inside baseball here to a Scotsman, but our audience may not know that the human rights activist and author Ayaan Hirsi Ali is Niall Ferguson's wife, and she has been a guest at FOLCS. And I remember when she was on our stage, she said, I will never forget this, she said, you know, it's interesting to think that Americans don't understand that what Iranians think when you rush to the table to enter into a deal, that they don't see it the way we see it, right? They don't see it, oh, well, look at that, conciliatory gestures, diplomatic initiatives. And she was saying, look, I just think it's very hard for Americans to understand that in other parts of the world, what they see is something very, a capitulation, a fear, a complete misreading of the map. So let's go back to the Kissinger book, because that's another one of my favorite Ferguson books. I know there's a second volume coming up. When people think of Kissinger in this country, and I know you've had extraordinary access to him, hence the diaries, the letters that you mentioned a moment ago. But he, for us in America who think about him, he's the patron saint of Realpolitik, right? That's what we think. We think of him, we think of that. We're not so sure oftentimes whether we should think that it's a good thing, Realpolitik, because it's associated with Kissinger, but it is what it is. So I'm wondering, given who you are as a historian and someone who's written about Kissinger, what is the Realpolitik that's going on right now? Or what ought to be? If you were Secretary of State, I would prefer that you would be, but if you were Secretary of State and being a historian, someone who A, does not forget history, and an Englishman, so you have a sense of World War II as well, you'd come with a lot, Foggy Bottom would have a lot of talent there in that office if you were there. What would you, if you were taking a Kissinger position, a Realpolitik, how should we see it? Because I look at this and think, well, China is a growing threat, and Islamic extremism has not gone away. And in Europe continues to be a problem because of and I think you've written about this before, this, you know, inability to separate secular and religious life. And in fact, an odd sort of doubling down of piety in Europe, right? Even more religious, that creates these no-go zones in Paris. So these are concerns that Europeans should still have. And here we are with Putin and this matter with Ukraine. Have we lost is the Realpolitik centered in Ukraine, or is it someplace else?
Look, a couple of clarifications first, Thane. No Scotsman can ever let pass being called an Englishman. I'm a Scotsman. That's important.
You know, you're right. I'm sorry about that, because, you know, I have seen Braveheart.
A film in which an Australian represents the Scots as a backward people, which we certainly were not.
Yes, right. All that painting on the face. Yeah.
None of that was historically accurate. The second clarification is that I don't think it's right to think of Kissinger as the arch Realpolitiker, because volume 1 of my biography is called The Idealist, very deliberately, right, because I think he's far more in a Kantian tradition in which the paramount objective is peace. But by peace, in the case of the Cold War, that meant above all the avoidance of nuclear war. So I tend to think he's misrepresented in a lot that's written about him in the United States, because people have this idea in their minds that realism is just a kind of amorality.
Right.
And because bad things happened in the 1970s, then Henry Kissinger must be amoral, if not immoral.
And realism is the very opposite of humanitarianism.
Right.
Right. That's what people think when they say.
And so part of the reason for writing this biography is to try to explode some of these misconceptions. Mm-hmm. But you asked a question which was essentially, what would Kissinger do if he was Secretary of State, or what would I do if in some strange parallel universe I got a job like that? And I think a good example of what would be different is the way that the Nixon administration, and it was mainly Kissinger by that point, handled the 1973 crisis in the Middle East. If you think about it, Ukraine's situation is a bit like that of Israel at that time, in the sense that it wasn't in NATO, and it was threatened by neighbors, and it was heavily reliant on the US for arms. But when the Arab states attacked Israel, although the top priority was to make sure that the Israelis didn't lose, which meant getting them planes, getting them some serious firepower, very quickly, if you read any accounts of the Yom Kippur War, Kissinger moved to try to stop the fighting, to achieve a ceasefire. He took some bold steps to make sure that the Soviet Union didn't intervene when the war began to go against the Arab states. And I think anybody who reads an account like Martin Indyck's new book of how Kissinger handled those negotiations can't fail to be impressed by the way he used American leverage to stop the war and embark on a path that ultimately led to Camp David in the next administration, or rather the next but one in Jimmy Carter's administration, a peace that rested on Egypt's reconciliation with Israel. Now, that's, I think, a good illustration of a different way of handling a crisis like this, where you use the leverage that you have. We have leverage over the Ukrainians. We're arming them. We have leverage over the Russians because the sanctions are really largely the work of the US. Why, this is really my question, why is Antony Blinken not taking a much larger role in the diplomatic efforts to end this war? Why is he leaving it to Turkey or to Israel? Why is he leaving it to the Europeans? That none of those other countries have the leverage that the United States has. None of those other countries, I think, can bring this war even to a temporary conclusion. So I think there is a Kissingerian option here that's not really being pursued. And I've come to the conclusion it's because the administration has decided to let the war keep going because they think that's in our interest. They're actually the ones engaged in realpolitik, paradoxically.
All right, I'm going to take one more question. I'm going to get one more question, and we're going to take some from the audience. But this is somewhat connected to one of my other favorite Niall Ferguson books, although I forgot the title now. The book that has 10 killer apps, and it's basically
6. I regret.
Oh, 6, right? So the idea there is to say, how did it happen that the European countries, the West, ended up with, when they started out, say in the 1500s, with a very small part of influence around the world, and eventually, create empire. So you could say the United States. You've also written about the British Empire. And of course, you have, so do I, a lot of affection for the traditional liberal traditions of Kant and Locke and Hume, and the whole concept of representative democracy, scientific inquiry, freedom of speech, right? All of those, what you would call, I guess, the killer apps that led these countries to create such empires. The question I have goes to Russia, which is to say, you said earlier that you didn't think that the end result here is going to be Putin's departure. You didn't imagine that would happen. But one question I have is, what is it, and I'm asking you now as a historian that has written about this, what is it about that, like, for instance, Arab Spring, on the 2nd anniversary, I wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal where I said, happy birthday. Where are you today? There was one democratic country, Tunisia, and the rest of it was a mess, right? After all of that at Tahrir Square, a mess. We have the czars, we have the communist dictators, we have the oligarchs and Putin. I don't expect that you'd ever find a liberal democracy in Russia, no matter what replaced it. Why is that? Is this purely cultural? What is it around the world that makes democracy appealing and can stick in the ground? And in some places, it's just a nuisance. And people say, get away from me, give me my dictator.
Well, that's a tough question, Thane. The book Civilization argued that there were these 6 ideas and institutions that set Western Europe apart and then set those places where lots of West Europeans settled apart, like North America. And the key institutions and ideas were that the idea of competition as something legitimate in economic and political life. The idea of the rule of law based on private property rights is a sort of central foundation with equal treatment of individuals before the law. The notion of science, the scientific method, the scientific revolution. And then I added three others: modern medicine, which really originated in the West and transformed our life expectancy. The work ethic, something Max Weber noticed as a distinctive feature of the West. And finally, the consumer society, without which there's really no point having an industrial revolution. So these are the things that really originated in Western Europe, and they spread where West Europeans settled to varying extents. There are parts of the world that have downloaded some of those killer apps in more recent times. In Asia, there was a conscious effort in Japan first to copy them. In more recent times, China has copied a number of the killer apps, but not all of them. For example, although the Chinese have certainly got the work ethic, and they have the beginnings certainly of the consumer society, science, modern medicine, but when it comes to political competition and the rule of law, forget about it. And it's not going to happen because the Chinese Communist Party can't tolerate either of those things. Russia attempted in the 1990s to download the killer apps, but it didn't work. And it didn't work because I think the rule of law never really took root. And that meant that quite quickly the market economy became a mafia economy.
Right.
And instead of entrepreneurs, you had the oligarchs.
Right.
And the political system transitioned really quite quickly back to an authoritarian regime. But if I may add another point, if you look at a map of Russia, it is a vast, sprawling empire. It is not a nation state. The people who carried out the atrocities in Bucha were people who come from the far east of Russia to the east of North Korea on the Chinese border. They're people from more than 4,000 miles away from Kyiv. The mistake I think we often make is to think of Russia as just a kind of big European country, but it's not. It's a Eurasian empire that did not fall apart when the Soviet Union fell apart. In fact, it remained remarkably intact. And I don't think there's any plausible way in which this vast, sprawling territory with its very heterogeneous population, 16% or thereabouts are Muslim. A lot of the soldiers fighting in Mariupol are Chechens. I don't think this is ever likely to become a democracy. Ukraine has a shot at being a democracy. And that is, I think, the real reason that Putin invaded it, just to make a point that's important. Whatever Putin's stated goals may be, and we talked about them earlier, the real goal is to make sure that Ukraine cannot be a successful Western-oriented democracy, prosperous, free, because that would be the ultimate reproach of Putin's own system. And I think he would rather it was a smoldering ash heap, a charnel house, than that it succeeded in that effort.
All right, let's take a couple questions from the audience and we'll say good night to Neil. This comes from Dr. John Shore from Nevada. His question, very simply, will this start World War III?
Probably not, but I can't be certain about that. I would say it's more like the 1970s than the 1940s. That is to say, my base case is that this plays out more like 73 to 79. It creates a big inflationary shock in the world. It triggers some crises elsewhere, but it doesn't actually turn into World War III. Why do I worry? What's my downside scenario? I've already mentioned it. If the war escalates with the use of chemical and nuclear weapons, and then coincides or is shortly followed by crises in the Middle East and in the Far East, then we end up with that kind of agglomeration of crises around the world that we call a world war. World War II was really lots of different wars that all happened in relatively close proximity in time. We could end up repeating that history, but I still think that's the lower probability scenario, and the higher probability is the 1970s all over again.
Last question. This comes from Nina Roshuk. Doesn't say where she's from. She says, how does the war in Ukraine compare to the war in Chechnya? Have the Russians used the same strategy?
It's very good to compare it because, of course, that war, or the two wars in Chechnya, were characterized by massive levels of destruction, brutal bombardment of Grozny and other cities, and very high casualties. Unfortunately, that has been the Russian way of war. It was in Syria too, when Russian forces became involved in that war. And so when I say the war isn't over, I'm afraid to say we can already see in Mariupol and in Kharkiv that Russian way of war being waged in Ukraine as well. And my nightmare, and maybe this is an appropriate note on which to conclude, my nightmare is that Putin, in a relatively short space of time, can inflict vastly more destruction on Ukraine than he already has. And I don't think we are doing enough to avert that. It's a remarkable country, Ukraine. It's had the roughest history of almost any country I can think of. Poland, perhaps, is the only one that compares, just in terms of the sheer amount of organized lethal violence that has happened on its territory over the last 100 and 150 years. But there's a chance that it can avoid another calamity. But I think it's only going to avoid it if we in the West approach this question with a greater sense of the enormous risks that both your questioners have just alluded to, the ultimate risk of Ukraine being completely destroyed. That has to be taken much more seriously than I think it's currently being taken.
That is a very poignant way to stop. Thank you, Neil. Before we say goodnight to you, I think we have a couple quick announcements. Yep. Our annual International Short Film Competition. It's one of our more popular events. It's April 28th. It's going to be virtual again this year. That means these films come from all over the world, 20 minutes or less in any genre. It's one of the more popular events that we have. And with the virtual feature, we end up seeing the filmmakers excitedly receiving their FOLCS awards. So tune in on April 28th. You can, you're going to get, I think it says 5 days of screening. So you'll be given links to go watch the finalist films, and all of you can vote for audience favorites. So don't forget, this is our 9th annual FOLCS Awards night. Let's see what else we have, man. And of course, if not already on our mailing list, please go to folks.org, and that way you'll get information for advance notice of our future events, and you'll be able to register. And of course, we are a nonprofit that depends on the donations of our friends and our audience. We haven't charged at all during the pandemic, so keep us in our thoughts. Neil, this was really wonderful. As always, you make us much smarter, and you really raised all of our game. And so thank you very much. And you're such a wonderful friend. And can I only just lastly, before I say goodnight to you, to say that I want to speak as an American, and you are an American citizen as well now. America is just better, richer, having you on this side of the Atlantic than the other one. Neil, thank you again, my friend. We'll see you again.
Thank you, Thane, very much indeed. Thanks to everybody who tuned in.
I'm Thane Rosenbaum from FOLCS. Until next time, good night.